I'm doing great, Mike. How about you?
All right, today we're going to discuss the top 10 offenses in NFL history, an idea that was given to us by Rich yesterday on the show. And I want to tell everybody, anybody that wants to participate, you can go ahead on Facebook or YouTube, message any comments or reactions to our top 10. But Sam, let's go ahead and get started with the top 10. What's your number 10 offense in NFL history?
I think you and I are going to have very different lists when we come down to this, but I should say there's about 15 teams I considered for this top 10 spot. Number 10, I ended up going with the Miami Dolphins from 1984. That year, they finished first in points, first in total yards, 16th in rushing yards, and first in passing yards. Of course, that was the season Dan Marino threw for over 5,000 yards, 48 touchdowns. The Dolphins went on to lose the Super Bowl to the San Francisco 49ers. I think that was a pretty good offense. I don't think they had the running game itself was an issue because they didn't have a standout running back. But of course, you have Marino, Mark Clayton, and Mark Duper were both in their primes at that point in time. So I think that's one of the best offenses that we've seen.
All right, I've got number 10. I've got the 1941 Bears. The Bears went 10-1 in 1941. They scored 396 points. Remember, that was a 12-game season, which was an average of 36 points a game. George McAfee was second in the NFL in rushing, carrying the ball 65 times for 474 yards, 12 touchdowns. And you had Norm Stanley, who was fourth in rushing with 414 yards. The rushing yards were not great back then, Sam. But Sid Luckman, who I think was one of the first – he was like the precursor to modern-day quarterbacks, him and Sammy Ball, led all quarterbacks by completing 57.1% of his passes. And they did all this outdoors under extremely different rules. And, I mean, you probably didn't even consider the 1941 Bears, did you, Sam?
No, they're not. They're actually not one of the teams here. I have some teams from like the 1940s on my list, or at least I considered some, but I didn't put them in the top 10.
All right, my number 9, I'm just going to go ahead, is the Miami Dolphins. And if there would have been a running game here, then I could see putting them a lot higher. But this was, at the time, Dan Marino's 48 touchdowns, over 5,000 yards, was something that the NFL had never seen. And the receivers were no slouches. The offensive line was extremely good. The wide receivers were Mark Clayton and Mark Super Duper, which was a formidable duo. And 18 of Clayton's 73 receptions were for touchdowns. And that 84 Dolphins team was in a weak AFC, but they put up 45 points on Chuck Noll in the AFC Championship game. And this is a team that the year before in Marino's rookie season had put up big numbers, but had failed in the playoffs, where they got upset in the divisional round by the Seattle Seahawks. But in 1984, they kind of rolled through the playoffs. They beat the Seahawks in a rematch, 31-10 in the AFC divisional playoff. Then put 45 on the Steelers, and they played great for a quarter in Super Bowl 19. But then the problem was San Francisco's defense was just a lot better, and they had a running game. But the problem here was no running game, which was usually the problem with Marino's offenses, Sam.
Yeah, I think we've seen there's quite a few offenses that I looked at up to potentially put on my list. I think one of the base issues for them was that there are a lot of teams that have great passing attacks, but just haven't put together good running games. That sometimes knocks you out of contention. And we've seen that even in the NFL when teams are not balanced offensively. You might have a great passer, but if you can't run the ball, sometimes you run into trouble. The Kansas City Chiefs from this past season were a little bit of an outlier in that sense. They didn't have a great running game, but they still were able to go out and win the Super Bowl.
All right, who do you got at number 9, Sam?
Yeah, number 9, I've got a team that's more recent. I've got the 2011 New Orleans Saints. And we talked about Dan Marino in the passing game just this past round. But for me, Drew Brees in 2011, that was probably his best year of his career. He completed over 70% of his pass attempts for 5,476 yards and 46 touchdowns. At the time, those were NFL records. So I think it was a great dominant passing game. Of course, they finished first in passing yards. They actually finished sixth in rushing yards, even though they didn't have a single dominant running back. They had a very deep backfield with Darren Sproles, Pierre Thomas, Mark Ingram, and Chris Ivory. So they had a lot of good running backs that went on to be starters for different teams. Finished first in yards, second in total points. And of course, they go on and they lose in the division round to San Francisco 49ers, who ended up losing the next round to the New York Giants. But I think that 2011 team, but Drew Brees, because he was at his peak, was just a very dominant offense.
All right, what do you got at number 8?
Number 8, another team from the 2000s. I have the 2004 Indianapolis Colts. And I think you agree this list is a little more modern for me than I think what your list is going to be. But I picked the Colts because you just look at what they have. They had Peyton Manning at quarterback. That was a year threw for 4,557 yards and 49 touchdowns, only 10 interceptions that year. Edgar and James in the backfield, he's now in the Hall of Fame. You also had Reggie Wayne, Marvin Harrison, and Brandon Stokely all go for over 1,000 yards. So I think that was just the dominant offense because there were so many good weapons in that unit.
All right, my number 8 is the 1963 New York Giants, which I know is probably not on your list either. But I think what you forget about when you look at the offense, it was a lot harder to play offense back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, even the 70s than it was from the 80s on up. And there's a great photo of Y.A. Tittle kneeling on the field after the 1963 NFL championship game, blood streaming down his face. They lost to the Monsters at a midway, 14-10 in a championship game. But if you wanted to put points on the board the way the Giants did, you were going to go through some bumps like that and some blood. And Tittle that year was the NFL MVP. They had the highest scoring offense, 448 points in 14 games. And that's despite being shut out by the Steelers the second game of the season. He completed 60% of his passes, over 3,000 yards, 36 touchdowns. And you had Hall of Fame tackle Roosevelt Brown on a very good offensive line. And then Tittle's favorite targets were Del Schaffner, who caught 64 passes for 1,181 yards, which is an average of almost 20 yards per reception. And then, of course, you had the Hall of Famer Frank Gifford, who caught 42 passes for 657 and 7 touchdowns for the flanker slot. So I think this was the last great Giants team until Lawrence Taylor showed up almost 20 years later. And I think that Y.A. Tittle gets overlooked because I think he played in 5 NFL championship games, didn't win any of them. But my number 8's the New York Giants. And to try to transition off of that, I'm going to go number 7, the 1962 Green Bay Packers. And, you know, when you can power sweep your way to almost 30 points a game, you've got one of the most potent run games in NFL history. They had fullback Jim Taylor behind one of the greatest offensive lines of all time. We're talking Fuzzy Thurston, Forrest Gregg, Jerry Kramer, Jim Ringo. I mean, this was a great offensive line, maybe the greatest, if not the greatest, definitely in the top 5. They led the league in rushing, 1,500 yards, scored an NFL record 17 touchdowns on the ground. Bart Starr led the NFL in passing completion, 62.5%, which back then is a huge number. Most guys were hovering around the 50% range. He threw for almost 2,500 yards in 12 games, and they outscored opponents 415 to 148. I think this is a team that kind of gets lost because they were more of a run-dominant team, Sam, than anything else.
Well, yeah, we know now, like, especially when we're looking at the numbers, we're looking for large passing numbers in the modern offense. But again, that team, you look at what they had in the backfield. Jim Taylor, Tom Moore, Paul Horton, like, they had so much there. The offensive line, you already brought it up. I mean, they just had such a dominant group in that offensive front. They only managed to beat the Giants 16-17 in the championship game, but reality in the rest of the season was really most of them stomping over every other team, with the exception of the one loss they had to the Detroit Lions. And that was a team that I had in consideration. I do have them actually higher on my list here.
Well, and the thing you got to realize, the 16-7 win in New York at the Polo Grounds was against a team that had Y.A. Tittle. That was a great football team they beat. But on top of that, I think it was like 0 degrees. The field was hard as hell. And, I mean, they basically I've seen the game, not the whole game, of course, but I've seen most of the plays in the game. And that game was basically that Green Bay Packer offense was so good. Those 16 points, probably they had time of possession 40-20 or 45-15 over them. So when you have a great run game, a dominant run game, in a game like that, the fact that they can still, when you know they're going to run the ball and the weather's that bad, to still be able to run the ball against a great Giants defense shows how great they were.
Yeah, I mean, and those Packer teams back in the day, back during that time, were just dominant all around. I think a lot of those guys get forgotten too often when we talk about the all-time great players. Guys like Bart Starr, Jim Taylor, they don't get talked about enough when we're usually bringing up more modern conversations about the greatest football players.
All right, who do you got at number 7, Sam?
Number 7, I have the 1983 Washington Redskins. This was a team that finished first in points, third in total yards, third in rushing yards, and seventh in passing yards. So it wasn't like they were dominant in actually any one facet of the game. We got Joe Theismann at quarterback. You got John Riggins in the backfield. He ran for 24 touchdowns that year. You got receivers. You got Art Monk and Charlie Brown. So you had a lot of players on that team. That was a very talented roster. Even though I don't think they were very statistically dominant in any one category. I think that was just a great football team. They ended up losing the Super Bowl to the Los Angeles Raiders in a kind of blowout game. But I still think that was a phenomenal team. They went 14-2 in the regular season. I think John Riggins and that offensive line were one of the best groups you could possibly have.
Yeah, I've actually got them at number 7 also. And that 541 points at the time is still the second highest in NFL history. Of course, they got bludgeoned by the LA Raiders 38-9 in the Super Bowl, but they never scored fewer than 23 points in a game except for that Super Bowl. And Theismann was unreal. Riggins was and they had one of the great offensive lines of all time. You had guys like Charlie Brown, who caught 78 for 1225, Art Monk. They had Mark Mosley, who booted 161 points through the uprights that year. So, yeah, I mean, and the question is this. I think this, Sam, I think if they win that Super Bowl against the Raiders, you're probably seeing them ranking in the top 3 on almost everybody's list. But that was a game where the Raiders just kind of took them apart.
Yeah, and if they'd been a close game, I think it would have been different too. But the Raiders absolutely destroyed them. I think that's really what changed the whole thing. And also, if he had won that year, they would have won back-to-back Super Bowls. That would have changed the perception of that team quite a bit. So you win 2 Super Bowls back-to-back, that puts you in an elite group. And also, that was a good Raiders team. So you go out there and you beat the Raiders to win back-to-back Super Bowls. I think that adds a lot to the legacy there. But unfortunately, you go out, you lose significantly, and that kind of just – I mean, it kind of puts you in the background when we discuss some of the greatest offenses of all time.
Well, and the other thing goes the other way. If you look at the 1983 NFC Championship game, a game where the Redskins beat the 49ers 24-21, maybe one of the worst officiated games in NFL history. The 49ers probably should have won that game, and it probably should have been a San Francisco, Los Angeles Raiders Super Bowl. Let's see. We both gave number 7. You want to go ahead and go with your number 6, Sam?
Yeah, my number 6. This is a team that didn't make it to the Super Bowl, but it was the 1998 Minnesota Vikings. Now, this was a team that was very dominant during the regular season. They went 15-1. Unfortunately, they ended up losing in the conference championship game to the Atlanta Falcons by 3 points. That was the game they missed the field goal, right?
Yeah, Gary Anderson, who had made every kick all year, missed the one that ended their season.
Yeah, and he missed it when it mattered most. That was a very good team, and they honestly could have made a Super Bowl based on what they were doing that year. Randall Cunningham threw for 34 touchdowns, only 10 interceptions. The running game, I mean, it wasn't fantastic, but you still had Robert Smith, who ran for over 1,000 yards. And then, of course, the receivers were what caught everyone's eyes. It was Randy Moss and Chris Carter. So, I mean, that was just the personnel-wise, that was a very dominant offense, and it wasn't a bad team either. I mean, like I said, only one loss in the regular season, and you lose the game in the playoffs based on just the fluke miss that you didn't expect from your kicker, based on how well he played during the regular season.
Yeah, and the bad thing is, I think a Super Bowl 33 between Denver and Minnesota would have been one of the great Super Bowls in NFL history. Instead, we got Denver and Atlanta, and it's not a shot on Atlanta, but any given Sunday, anybody can beat anybody, and that was proven that year. Where are we at? My number 6, I'm going to go with the 1994 San Francisco 49ers. Steve Young set an NFL record with 112.8 QB rating. Translated into real numbers, Young completed more than 70% of his passes for almost 4,000 yards, 35 touchdowns. His main receiver, of course, was Jerry Rice, who I think we both believe was the greatest wide receiver in NFL history. He caught 112 passes for almost 1,500 yards and 13 touchdowns. You had Ricky Waters, who caught 66 out of the backfield. You had Brett Jones at tight end, who snagged another 49. I mean, this was a complete offense. They could run the ball. They could pass the ball. And the thing in my mind that really puts them up the list is the playoff run they had. You had the first round drubbing against the Bears, 44-15, where Ricky Waters set an NFL record with 5 touchdowns. Then they beat the great Dallas Cowboy team, who had just won a couple Super Bowls in a row, 38-28. And then in the Super Bowl, the 49ers just destroyed the Chargers, 49-26, behind Steve Young's record 6 touchdown passes. Their average postseason points per game, Sam, was 44.
Yeah, and that's a ridiculous run. Let me ask you this, though. Would you rather have that 94 group, or would you rather have the 1989 49ers who had Joe Montana, Roger Craig, and, of course, they still had Jerry Rice and John Taylor? Which group would you prefer if I gave you an option between 89 and 94?
I would take the 94 offense.
94?
I think 94, I think he had a better offensive line. And I think this. I mean, I think Steve Young really gets underrated when it comes to quarterbacks. If you look at the skill set of Steve Young and Joe Montana, is Joe Montana really better? I mean, the difference is this. Steve Young started out his career. He didn't want to go to the Cincinnati Bengals. Can't blame him for that, 1983. He goes to the USFL with the LA Express for a couple of years. And then he gets stuck with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers for a few years. And then he finally gets to Tampa Bay or San Francisco in 1987, and he's backing up Joe Montana. So right there, you wiped out 5 or 6 years of his career that if he has those 5 or 6 years on a decent team, I mean, I think he would go down as one of the top 5 quarterbacks in NFL history. And when you look at the 89 team compared to the 94 team, I think 89, I think you've got better tight end play. You don't have the depth at running back, I don't think. But, I mean, I really think the closer offense that I would compare more to 94 would be the 1985 San Francisco 49ers. And that's because you didn't have Jerry Rice, but what you did have in the backfield was Roger Craig and Wendell Tyler. They were loaded there. So let's face it, all 3 49ers offenses are all-time great offenses. If I'm listed in top 15, all 3 are there. But I like 89 just because I think Steve Young had one of the greatest, most overlooked years in NFL history.
Well, I think about it this way. He really didn't become a starting quarterback until he was 30 years old already.
I mean, he wasn't the starter, the full-time starter, until you get to, 1991 when Joe Montana got hurt.
Yes, I mean, if he goes on a team and starts being a star in 1987, that's 4 or 5 more years of starting quarterback play. As it is, he retired with an MVP, 3 Super Bowls, and 7 Pro Bowls, and 2 MVPs actually. So, I mean, imagine you had 4 or 5 more years of that. Exactly where he would fall. I mean, he'd be up there. He'd be top 7 all time probably.
Well, how about this? What if in 1983 he goes into the draft and the Bengals select him instead of the Bengals selecting Boomer Esiason? Then he's on the Bengals team with Eddie Brown, Tim McGee, James Brooks, all these guys. He spends 5 years there. He probably goes to a Super Bowl, maybe wins one. Then the Bengals can't afford to pay him, and he ends up in San Francisco to replace Joe Montana in 1991 anyway.
Yeah, I mean, and even Esiason had some success with the Bengals. I mean, he won an MVP, right? He got them.
He won the MVP in 1988. And you can make a debate. 1986, or 1985 and 1986, the Bengals were right around the 8-8, 9-7 mark, just barely missing the playoffs. In 1986, they were 10-6. Steve Young was better than Boomer Esiason. So it's possible maybe the Bengals from 1983 to 1990 make the playoffs 5 or 6 times. The AFC wasn't very strong. Maybe Steve Young goes to a couple extra Super Bowls. But in the end, you can't go wrong with chilling for 6 or 7 years and then taking over for Joe Montana and throwing the ball to Jerry Rice. Where are we at? Your number 5 or my number 5 or what?
Yeah, we're both at our number 5s. My number 5, we already talked about this, but I'll just go through it right now. It's my number 5 is the 1962 Green Bay Packers, like we talked about earlier.
Okay, we talked about it earlier, so we don't have to talk about it again. You're right. But that was a great offense. My number 5, I'm going to go back to 1950. The 1950 Los Angeles Rams featured Hall of Fame quarterback Norm Van Brocklin and Bob Waterfield, future Hall of Fame receivers Elroy, Crazy Legs Hirsch, Tom Fears. They hold the NFL record for points per game. They averaged 38.8 points a game during the regular season. Now, one week the Rams beat the Colts 70-27. The next week they beat the Lions 65-24. They scored 41 points in that third quarter. The Rams offense set 22 records in 1950, including most passing yards and most total yards. Fears caught a remarkable 84 passes for 1,116 yards in a 12-game season. I mean, those numbers today would be remarkable if you're just counting it over 12 games. That included a record 18 receptions against the Packers. He caught 7 passes for 198 yards in the divisional playoffs. The Rams featured 3 1950 All-Pro linemen, Dick Huffman, Bob Reinert, and Frank Numitz. And they paved the way for an excellent running game. They had 1946 Heisman winner Glenn Davis, 1950 All-Pro Dick Horner, and Paul Berry. So this is a team that had legendary linemen, legendary wide receivers, 2 legendary quarterbacks, and 3 very good, if not legendary, running backs. So, I mean, when you look at this, they were a complete offense. And it was unseen in 1950 to have an offense like this.
Yeah, they almost won the championship game, but fortunately they ran into Otto Graham when they got there in the Cleveland Browns, and Cleveland ended up taking it 30-28. But I mean, that was, like you said, you ran through all of it. I mean, that's really a loaded offense. I actually hadn't even looked at this team. I looked at like the 1954 Rams was the one I actually considered putting on the list, but I didn't look at the 1950 Rams. And you're right. I mean, this is a loaded unit. You've got guys across the board. I mean, you got two quarterbacks up there who are legends. So I think it's a phenomenal unit. You're looking at this. This is probably maybe the deepest offense we've discussed so far.
All right, Sam, what do you got for number 4?
Number 4, I've got the 1981 San Diego Chargers. I think we brought this up the other day. I think this is the one you actually mentioned yesterday when we were talking about this briefly. The Chargers this year went 10-6 with Don Coryell as their head coach. Dan Fouts threw for 4,802 yards, 33 touchdowns. And they had Chuck Muncie at running back. Pass catchers, they had Charlie Joyner, Wes Chandler, they had Kellen Winslow running out there. So they just had a full, complete team with guys basically at every position that can make plays. And I think this was just a phenomenal offense. Unfortunately, they couldn't go any further than they did in the playoffs. They got stopped at the conference championship game by the Cincinnati Bengals. I'm sure you're happy about that. Of course, we had the legendary divisional round game against the Miami Dolphins where we had the picture of Kellen Winslow being carried off the field because he's so exhausted. So I've got the 1981 Chargers at my number 4 spot.
Well, I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add to whatever you say here because I think we're going to be pretty close to being the same thing. And if you miss one, I'll bring it up. But, yeah, this Chargers team averaged more than 30 points a game. Fouts threw the ball 609 times. But people remember Chuck Muncie was a great running back, 1,144 yards, 19 touchdowns. And, you know, this was a team that was put together by Don Coryell, who had done the same thing a few years before for the St. Louis Cardinals. You had Jim Hart, you had Metcalf. They had a great offense in St. Louis. St. Louis hadn't been good ever until Coryell got there. And then Coryell transfers, goes over in 1977 or 78 to the Chargers. Chargers make the playoffs in 79. They make the playoffs in 80. They make it in 81. Actually, 80 might have been their best all-around team in 79 and 80 because they had a better defense than the 81 team did. But when you look at Kellen Winslow, catches 89 passes, 1,290 yards. Charlie Joyner, 70 catches, 1,188. Wes Chandler, 52 for 857. Chuck Muncie, Dan Fouts. I mean, you can't get much better than that. You had Ed White on the offensive line. You had a great offensive line. And, you know, this is an offense that I think a case could be made for number 1. And that case would be even better if they'd had a defense and could have gotten to and possibly won Super Bowl 16. Because the difference between the Bengals and Chargers was the Bengals had a very stout defense and the Chargers didn't.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard sometimes to judge offenses then based on whether they win or lose sometimes because it's not always on the offense. They had a great team there. It's just that they didn't have the full complete unit. They didn't have a defense really to keep pace with how great their offense was.
All right, what do you got at number 3, Sam?
My number 3 offense of all time, I got the 2013 Denver Broncos. And this is the year that Peyton Manning went out and threw for 5,477 yards, 55 touchdowns. Those were records at the time. The team went 13-3 during the regular season. They lost to the Super Bowl, and they got clobbered in the Super Bowl by Seattle Seahawks 43-8. That's kind of why I have them down at 13 because they didn't show up in the play. They didn't show up in the Super Bowl. Peyton Manning didn't play well during that game. The offense wasn't moving at all. But they still had some good running backs. I mean, they had Noshawn Moreno run for over 1,000 yards. They had Monty Ball run for over 500 yards. C.J. Anderson was on that depth chart, even though he didn't play a lot. At receiver, you got Demaryius Thomas and Eric Decker both went for over 1,200 yards. Julius Thomas at tight end, and also Wes Welker. So to me, that's just a very complete offense. Your offensive line wasn't fantastic. The offensive line has some issues there. But in terms of skill position-wise, it was a very good team.
All right. I think you're nuts for putting him in the top 10 because I don't think he can be a top 10 all-time offense without having a great offensive line. I think this is the first time you've brought up a team that had a subpar offensive line. And I think we saw that even when they won the Super Bowl a year or two later, where the offensive line still wasn't very good. They won with defense when they did win a Super Bowl. So I think you're stretching at number 3 with this team. And I don't think the running game is very good either. So without a running, I mean, they were basically just throwing the ball all over the place. And my point is this, you look at like the 81 Chargers. The 81 Chargers could beat you running the ball or throwing the ball. Now they're going to choose to throw it, but if they have to run it, they can. When you compare this Broncos team, I think when you get to the top 10, you need to have a complete offense. And I think that there's no way they're near a complete offense, Sam.
That's fair. I even said, like, I believe their offensive line was weaker than what I discussed in the past, especially when you look at other units we brought up. We brought up the Redskins from 1983. That was a great offensive line. We talked about the Packers in 62, also a very good offensive line. We even talked about how the Chargers had a really good line. So I think I agree with you. It's a little bit of an outlier. I still put them up there because they were throwing the ball all over the place, but at the same point, I could see why you would want them lower or off the list.
Yeah, but see, the problem with throwing the ball all over the place, in 2013, they lost to the Seahawks. I think that Seahawk team, and we'll do a show on the 10 best defenses. I think there is a case to be made that that's the greatest defense of all time. And the reason I would make that case is it's harder to play defense now than it was in the past. 1976, Pittsburgh Steelers could mug your wide receivers. A lot of things change over time. So I will say this. Would you consider, or do you believe the 2013 Seahawks were the greatest defense of all time?
No.
Okay. And they held what you are saying is the third best offense of all time to 8 points because they had a bad offensive line and no running game. They were forced basically to throw the ball on every play, and they just abused Peyton Manning.
Yeah, they did. They really beat the hell out of them pretty much.
All right. So have I changed your mind?
Yes, you have. You got it.
All right. What do you got at number 2?
I saw where you're going with that. I'm like, oh, no, I've lost this one. But, yeah. No, I think number 2, and this team did have a good offensive line as opposed to Denver. It was the 2007 New England Patriots. That's the year they went 16-0, but they lost the Super Bowl to the New York Giants. Brady threw for 50 touchdowns, 4,800 yards, only 8 interceptions. Running back, they didn't have one standout running back, but they had Kevin Falk, Sammy Morris, and Lawrence Maroney. And at receiver, of course, they had Randy Moss, Wes Welker, Dante Stallworth, and Jabbar Gaffney, and also Ben Watson at tight end. So they had a little bit of versatility along that front. And then, of course, the offensive line, Matt Light, Logan Mankins, and then Dan, I'm hoping I'm going to say his last name right, Dan Copen at center. So they had some Pro Bowlers on that line as well. I think that compares favorably to the Denver Broncos.
Well, which Denver Broncos? 2013?
Yeah, 2013.
All right. And the other way to compare is, who was the running back?
Lawrence Maroney and who did I say? Kevin Falk.
So once again, one-dimensional. And the thing is this. In the Super Bowl, they were held to what? 14 points?
Yes, 14 points.
All right. Because they couldn't run the ball. And because if all you got to do is defend one thing, usually if you're – and the New York Giants won that Super Bowl because their defensive line, I mean, everybody in that rotation was on Brady like white on rice all game long. So I think, once again, with the numbers they put up, if you put them between 5 and 10, I could agree with it. But I still think that's not a complete offense. I mean, the way they played offense, if you would have played with the same rules as they had in 1975, I don't think you would have seen them be near as successful because I don't think the run game was that great.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's a difference between you're trying to compare eras like that. If we're talking about a team that was better with the run defense, I mean, you asked me what Denver Broncos team I was talking about. If you're talking about a really good Denver Broncos offense that I didn't put on the list, how about the 1998 Denver Broncos?
Well, see, to me, the 1998 Denver Broncos are worlds ahead of the 2013 Broncos because you had one of the greatest running backs of all time. You had an all-time great offensive line. You had a Hall of Fame quarterback, even though he was at the end of his career. You had great wide receivers. I think that there's no comparison between the 98 Broncos in either one of the offenses you just ranked at 2 and 3.
Yeah, that's what I thought you were going to say. When you asked me which Broncos, I thought that's the one you were referring to. But, yeah, so that's my number 2. You want my number 1 now?
Well, your number 1 has to be the 99 or 2000 St. Louis Rams, correct?
Yeah, it's the 99 Rams, yeah.
Yeah. Well, actually, if you look at them, they averaged more points in 2000.
Oh, they did? I didn't even look at that. I looked at 99. I saw first in points, first in yards, fifth in rushing yards, and first in passing yards. So I was like, that's good. That's number 1.
Yeah, but they averaged 33.8 points per game, which I think was like a point or two more than what they averaged the year before. And the only problem with 2000, they were ran by Mike Martz. And Mike Martz, the reason they scored more is because they wanted to throw the ball more. But when you got to the Super Bowl, Marshall Faulk only touched the ball 16 times in the Super Bowl. If Marshall Faulk touches the ball 25 times in that Super Bowl, they probably beat the New England Patriots. But when you look at them, Isaac Bruce, Torrey Holt, Marshall Faulk, I mean, all three to me are Hall of Famers. Marshall Faulk is one of the top 10 running backs of all time, I think, especially if you're going all purpose. That offense was damn near impossible to stop. And you had a great offensive line on top of it. And I think Mike Martz was a hell of an offensive coordinator. So I would take the 99 team too, because Dick Vermeil was in charge instead of Martz. But when you look at this, the other thing that's amazing about it is the fact that when Trent Green went down in like the second or third preseason game, everybody thought everything was done because nobody really outside of the Rams clubhouse locker room had any respect for Kurt Warner.
No, they didn't. They really didn't know who he was. To them, he was just kind of another guy at the point in time. And he was there in 98, but he only threw the ball 11 times. He only played in one game. So really didn't have any kind of NFL experience at that point in time. There was no hype around him really coming into the league because of the path he took to get there. It wasn't like he was a high draft pick or anything like that. He was already 28 years old in 99. And
yeah,
he
played college football at Northern Iowa. He got cut by the Green Bay Packers. You know, he bagged groceries. He played in the Arena Football League for the Iowa Barnstormers, which is what got him another chance. I think with the Barnstormers in 1996, he actually won an Arena Bowl. And then I think in 97, 98, somewhere around there, I think he actually played in the World League of American Football. I think he might have won a championship there. And then he gets his last shot with the Rams. Trent Green goes down. And the next thing you know, fast forward 20 years and Kurt Warner's in the Hall of Fame. And Kurt Warner, I mean, he took the Rams to 2 Super Bowls and the Cardinals to a Super Bowl. Right there, that made top Tom Brady going to the Super Bowl 9 times just because he did it with the Cardinals and the Rams. And, the Rams had a history of not getting that far. Of course, they made it in Super Bowl 14. But the fact that he got the Cardinals to the Super Bowl probably should have put him in the Hall of Fame immediately anyway.
Well, yeah, he had a career revival, too, when he was in Arizona because he kind of fallen off in St. Louis. Gone to New York, was there for a year with Eli, I think. And then he goes to Arizona. He goes back and he rounds back into form. And that was a really good offense, too, they had in Arizona. They had Larry Fitzgerald, Anquan Bolden. They had some really good weapons there as well.
All right, Sam. Tomorrow you want to do the top 10 defenses of all time?
Yeah, sure. That sounds good.
All right, we'll do that. And then Friday, we're going to have young Sam McGinnis in to try to argue why he thinks the Philadelphia Eagles need to replace Carson Wentz. That's always fun. I want to remind everybody, today at 2:30, we will have the old-time boxing show with myself, former HBO boxing historian Christopher Shelton on to recap the career of legendary Canadian heavyweight George Chuvalo. And then at 4 o'clock, Inside Boxing Weekly will be back after a 4-month hiatus with myself, an award-winning boxing author, and the guy who runs MaxBoxing.com, John Raspani. Sam, anything else you want to add? You want to throw in where people can find you on Twitter?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Sam_Teets33. And I think that's it. I think we covered everything for today.
All right, guys, you can follow me at The Grueling Truth. Make sure you go to the Facebook page for The Grueling Truth, where this show will be live daily, Monday through Friday. Make sure you check out Survive in Advance last night with myself, Sam, and 1981 national champion for the Indiana Hoosiers, Steve Risley, as we talk about whether sports should even be being attempted to be played right now. So make sure you check that out also. But me and Sam, or Sam and I, will see you tomorrow at 1 o'clock Eastern, where we talk about the top 10 defenses in NFL history. So for now, for Sam Teets, I'm Mike Goodpaster. You've been listening to The Grueling Truth, where the legends speak.